All right, welcome to Southern Sports Gumbo Week 9 recap. We did a special last night on the LSU coaching change. So tonight we're going to talk recaps of some games, but we're going to get started with some conference outlooks through 9 weeks of the season. It's becoming more clear who the contenders in each conference are. So we'll get started with the group of 5 teams this week. So you've got really the Mountain West Conference and you've got the American Conference. And over in the American, you've got two unbeatens in conference play. That's Navy and Tulane. And you've got a group of 4 teams that are all 3-1 in conference with Memphis, South Florida, North Texas, and Temple. I see this conference as more of a 4-team race. Navy does have a gauntlet coming up, but I'm going to keep them in contention since they're 5-0 right now. So I think Navy, Tulane, Memphis, and South Florida are your 4 contenders. But I think North Texas could really play a spoiler role in this conference. Looking at what Navy has on the horizon here, they're at North Texas this week. They're at Notre Dame next week, and then they get South Florida at home, then a bye week, and then they're at Memphis, and then they finish up in the Army-Navy game. So they've got 4 really tough games, 3 of the top 5 teams in their conference, and then Notre Dame. So they still have a lot of challenging contests up. Tulane, though, is kind of interesting. They've got a game at Memphis in 2 weeks. Outside of that, they play UTSA, FAU, Temple, and Charlotte. So I really like their chances to be able to reach the American Conference Championship game. Kevin, what are your thoughts on the American?
Very similar to what you're saying. Navy's been a team that we've kind of felt like all year would at some point hit a tough stretch and suffer some losses. That tough stretch is on them now. They may win these games. They've been able to win them, and they're obviously a good team. They're 7-0. So, but they got four straight games that are going to be tough, and 3 of them are on the road. So I still expect Navy to take a couple losses there. You referenced Tulane. I really like their chances with where they're at. That challenging game at Memphis was the game that got UCF this past weekend. We talked about UCF and Memphis last week, and UCF, not UCF, USF, South Florida. South Florida led that game the entirety of the game, and Memphis outscored them by 17 points in the fourth quarter, kind of reminiscent to Texas and Mississippi State. And then South Florida had a field goal to tie it at the end, long field goal, 52-yarders, wasn't able to make it. So Tulane faces that same obstacle in a couple of weeks. Can they go to Memphis and win? A couple other teams, and Memphis is one of them, that could be in that group of 5 team that come out of it. But again, I want to talk North Texas. You reference them as a spoiler. They're certainly that. They play Navy this week, this Saturday at noon. So this is their first chance to be a spoiler or also throw themselves in contention, because North Texas, like Tulane has a favorable schedule. North Texas also has a pretty favorable schedule down the stretch here. They host Navy, go on the road to UAB, and go to Rice and host Temple. If they win this Friday, again, they have an excellent chance of winning out and being there with 1 conference loss. And they are a 6.5-point favorite this Friday. So I think you got to throw North Texas, Tulane in that situation where they might win it because of just how their schedule lays out. When you look at Memphis, they host Tulane and then they host Navy at the end of the season. So Memphis has played some quality competition, but they've had every game at home, which, hey, that counts when you win. They beat Arkansas at home. They beat South Florida at home. They play Tulane, like we referenced, on the 7th, and then they play Navy on the 27th, the Thanksgiving Day, actually. So if they win all those games, Memphis could be in that conference championship. And when you look at those games, I think there's a good chance that they'll be favored from the way that their schedule lays out. The Memphis-Tulane spread could be very interesting. Tulane could be favored going into Memphis because Tulane is such a well-rounded, good team. And then, my team that I've been kind of leaning into that I thought would be the non-power 4, the power 5, or the group of 5, the representative, South Florida. they're not out of the conference hunt by no means, but with their loss to Memphis, it just gives them one conference loss, so they're still in the hunt there. But they do have one tough game left. They got to go on the road to Navy in the middle of November on the 15th, and that's a game they got to win now. They got to win out to have any chance to play in that conference championship. I don't, they have two losses now, even though they played some tough early games out of conference. They played Boise in one, played Florida in one, and lost to Miami. I don't think that they will be the representative out of this group of five, but I do think that they can win this conference. And if they beat Navy, I think they would play in that conference championship. So it's pretty wide open. You got Memphis with one loss, Navy and Tulane both undefeated. Even though I would not bet on Navy having less than two conference losses the way their schedule finishes. So, to me, that leaves Tulane, Memphis, South Florida, and North Texas as teams that I really have a good chance to having one loss to finish this thing out. Memphis, they host Tulane and they host Navy. So, again, if they win both of those games with a win over Arkansas, they could be in that conversation. So, to me, when I look at this and we look at the Mountain West. There's three teams over there. But when I look at the American, I would say the teams that I favor having a shot at being the representative from the group of five would be Tulane, North Texas, Memphis. Now that South Florida has two losses. And I think Tulane, Memphis, and North Texas all have a good shot at winning it. I think one of those teams will be standing at the end of the season with one loss. And they've all played good out of conference teams. Memphis beat Arkansas. Tulane went on the road to Ole Miss and lost. They beat Duke at home though. That's so they played two conference games, and so North Texas, I guess out of conference didn't play those teams, but certainly they will have played their share of teams inside the league. So, and then when you shoot over to the Mountain West, I think Boise's probably playing the best football right now, but they have two losses, and South Florida beat them pretty handily at the beginning of the season. You can't rule UNLV out, and then San Diego State has a shot at winning enough games to be in that conference championship. So I think you got those three teams that could play in the conference championship, with probably San Diego State or UNLV having the best chance to represent that conference as the representative from the group of five. What's your thoughts on the Mountain West?
Yeah, so the Mountain West is interesting to me because right now Boise State and San Diego State control their destiny. Both teams are undefeated in conference play. They do square off against each other though in a few weeks, November 5th. San Diego State does get to host that game. So here's a crazy scenario. UNLV has been my favorite group of five team all season. If they run the table and finish 11-1, and San Diego State beats Boise, so San Diego State in that hypothetical would also run the table, so they'd be undefeated in conference play. Boise State would have one loss. You would have an 11-1 UNLV team left out of their conference championship. And I think if Boise State is the team to win the Mountain West, you're likely getting an American Conference team into the playoff spot, unless you have a Conference USA team or Sun Belt team get hot here down the stretch and finish 11-1 and end up in the final polls. But I would lean if San Diego State can beat Boise State, and that's a rematch game. I would think Boise could have a chance to win that conference championship game. So they finished 9-3. You've got a 12 or 11-2 San Diego State and 11-1 UNLV. I don't think any of those three teams get in the group of five spots. So going to be really interesting. Really November 15th will be telling with 2 weeks left what happens for the group of five. I know the conference championship still plays a part in that for them, but I think you'll really start to see one team from each conference really emerge over the next 3 weeks, especially the American. They all play each other over the next few weeks. So excited to see how that shapes up. But let's move over to the ACC here. You've got two teams that are unbeaten in conference play, and that's the Georgia Tech Yellow Jackets and the Virginia Cavaliers. Then you've got a group of teams that are all one loss in the conference. Pittsburgh has really rallied back. They're 4-1. Louisville's 3-1. SMU's 3-1 after a terrible loss to Wake Forest. Duke's 3-1, and Miami's sitting at 2-1. I still think that this conference is a little bit more wide open. I think you definitely have some favorites in Georgia Tech for sure, Virginia being unbeaten in conference play, but I think Louisville, SMU, Duke, and Miami are all still good teams out of that conference. SMU is sitting at 5-3 overall, and Duke's sitting at 4-3. So, they would be teams who would have to get to the championship and win. You look at a team like Georgia Tech, if they stumble, with one game, or they end their season playing the Georgia Bulldogs, if they stumble in that one, I would still have them as a team to make the playoff. Team that I think can still play spoiler in this league. I'm still sticking with Clemson and Stanford as two teams who could upset somebody. What are your thoughts on the ACC, Kevin?
Yeah, we're starting to see it kind of separate a little bit. 2 weeks ago, it was really, really top heavy with several teams undefeated and one loss teams. There's still a lot of teams in this, but Virginia and Georgia Tech have started to separate themselves a little bit. And when you look at their schedules, Georgia Tech has a very favorable schedule conference wise. I really don't see them. They'll be favored in every conference game they have left. And then when you flip over and you look at Virginia's schedule, it's kind of a head scratcher. SMU played in the conference championship last year and didn't really play any of the top teams in the league. Now, Virginia did play Florida State when Florida State was undefeated and really had momentum. And turns out that, they were playing well at that time. And then Virginia went on the road to beat Louisville, kind of like SMU did last year. But when you look at Virginia's schedule, they play Cal this week. They're a favorite in that game. They play Wake Forest at home. They'll be favored there. The one game that they have that could trip them up, they go to Duke on that 5th November. So again, the 15th of November is going to be a big weekend. That's also the weekend Miami plays SMU. So, but let's say Virginia beats Duke, and then they play at home against Virginia Tech. Likely will win that game. So Virginia and Georgia Tech could both close this out and go undefeated in the regular season. And if they did that, that's going to stifle some good teams like Louisville and Miami and keep them out of that conference championship, and might squeeze this conference into a second bid. Miami did beat Notre Dame, who's playing well at the beginning of the season. So that could open the door for a second team if Louisville and Miami are sitting there 11-1 at the end of the season. Louisville does have a couple of tough games though. They play Clemson and they go on the road to SMU November 22nd, and they play those games back to back. Clemson's a Friday night game at Louisville. So, I would bet on Louisville to win that game, but you never know. And then that SMU game on the road will be tough. So I look at it, I think Virginia and Georgia Tech are the front runners in this, and they just got to take care of business. Now, Virginia's played well all year, and they did not play well this past Saturday. They played way down to their competition, and they played North Carolina. Were fortunate to win in overtime. North Carolina went for two in overtime and probably less than a half a yard, probably a football's length from winning that game. So Virginia's got to get back to their best level of football if they're going to win out. Pitt has 3 tough games in a row in a stretch in November, so I don't think I see Pitt in this. The other 2 teams that I see contending for that conference championship game would be Louisville and Miami. I've mentioned those teams. So I put those teams as the next best potential. And obviously, I would put Miami first, even though Louisville holds that head to head. But I would not be surprised if any one of these 4 teams I mentioned played in that conference championship, and that would be Georgia Tech, Virginia, Louisville, Miami. Those would be the 4 that I put with the best chances to play in the conference championship, with Georgia Tech the best, Virginia second, and then I guess you split Miami and Louisville. The spoilers, we've mentioned that. I think Pitt can play a spoiler role, and I think they will. Again, SMU, I think they're in that spoiler opportunity too by getting a chance to play Louisville. And then that's I guess Duke. I would throw Duke as a spoiler because they play a home game against Virginia. So I would count those teams as your best chance to spoil something. Again, if I look at, I just let's reference Georgia Tech's schedule just to know what they have. They're in a great place here. They play at NC State this Saturday. NC State's 4-4. Georgia Tech is a 6.5 point favorite. They go on the road to Boston College. Then they host Pitt. So they got 3 games in the conference left. Pitt's been a good team, so again, maybe that's their spoiler opportunity there. But man, you really got to like Georgia Tech in the way they're playing. That's kind of my thoughts on the ACC. I think it has an outside shot now of getting 2 teams with it would have to be a combination of Georgia Tech, Virginia, Miami, Louisville, I think, to get the 2 teams. And to do that, Virginia, because Virginia does have 1 loss. So I think Virginia would have to win that conference championship game for them to get 2. Any more thoughts there? Or are we rolling over into the Big 12?
Yeah, we can move over into the Big 12, and I'll let you get started on this one.
So this is a conference that's always year to year is pretty wide open, but this year has definitely got a couple of teams that are emerging themselves at the top of the league, and a couple of teams that when you go back to the beginning of the season, no one would have predicted that they would be at the top of the league. I think everybody thought Tech would be there, and they certainly are at 4-1, and in my opinion, still the favorites to win this league. But you have BYU and Cincinnati, who are both sitting at 5-0, and I don't think anybody would have predicted that both these teams would be 5-0. I want to start with BYU here because they have 3 really good wins in a row. Went to Arizona and won, came home, beat Utah in a rivalry game, go on the road, and they're down 14 points in the first half to Iowa State in a tough place to play. And they just keep fighting, and they ended up winning that game by double digits. And so BYU is one of those teams. They're well coached. They play tough. They're, you know, um, Kataki is a really good coach for them, and they play good defense. They don't beat themselves, and he just coaches them up with toughness. They run the ball well. Bear Bachmeier's done a great job coming into that role as a freshman quarterback, kind of thrown into the spot. But again, give his coaches credit for coaching him up and putting him in situations that he can succeed, and they've done that. So I think you got to keep BYU and Cincinnati in this. I think both of those teams, you can't count them out. Cincinnati's one of the better defensive teams in the conference, just like BYU. So again, that's why I don't think that you can count a Cincinnati out. Cincinnati has a game this week at Utah. So we're fixing to learn if they're for real or not. After that, though, they play Arizona at home, BYU at home, and then go on the road to TCU. If they can somehow get through this game, I would not predict them to get through this game without a loss, but if they somehow do, they have 3 winnable games at the end of the season. Utah 9.5 point favorite though going into this weekend. Then we mentioned Tech. I'll spend a minute on Tech. Just again, Tech's really good. They're good defensively. They're good offensively. Beat Oklahoma State 42-0 in a game that they probably could have won 60-0. So I just don't see Tech losing the rest of this season. I still think they have probably the best chance to play in this conference championship out of anybody and probably the best chance to advance. And again, when I look at their schedule, I just don't see a team that can beat them. Even though, BYU plays Tech, it's just in Lubbock. And I should not count BYU out because I said they would lose to Iowa State and they handled that game and controlled it. So I think you better not count BYU out of anything. Wow. But again, I still favor Tech to be in that conference championship, potentially come out of this league. Another team, much like Cincinnati in this league, is Willie Fitz. Man, he does a good job as a head coach. He did it at Tulane. He took over for Holgerson at Houston. They were about a 500 team for a few years under Holgerson, and now he has them set in 7-1. And again, they win with defense. They went on the road to Arizona State and won that game 24-16 in a game that they led by double digits. That was a backdoor touchdown at the end to make that an 8 point game by Arizona State. Houston, 1 loss in the league. They host West Virginia. They go to UCF. They host TCU. They go to Baylor. All 4 of those games are winnable for Houston. So Houston could win the next 4 games. And again, you say, okay, Houston's a spoiler. That's where we had them a couple of weeks ago in the spoiler role. Well, Houston's an absolute contender in this now. And, you could see Houston against Tech. You could see Houston against BYU in this conference championship game. And again, just like BYU, you better not count Houston out. So, if I had to, place a favorite, like I've already said, I'd definitely place the favorite on Houston, or excuse me, on Texas Tech. But the next two teams that I really like in this league are Houston and BYU, with Cincinnati with an outside shot. I don't even know. I think it's those four teams. I don't even know if I would say that there's a solid spoiler team. I had Arizona State in that spoiler role, and again, they could beat somebody, but I wouldn't throw them in there. I guess if I would play one spoiler right now out of these teams, because they're playing so darn well right now, is Kansas State. Kansas State really is looking back at the beginning of the season where they lost a couple of games, and especially to Iowa State to open the season, and then they lost on the road to Arizona. But man, you got around the 1st of October, September 27th, they beat UCF by 14. They did lose on the road to Baylor. That was a tough loss. But then they beat K State by 13. They absolutely manhandled Kansas on the road. So I guess Kansas State could be considered a spoiler. And when you look at them as a potential spoiler, they do have a game again this weekend that could absolutely throw this league in a frenzy for the best team in the league that I've talked about with Tech. Tech goes on the road to K State. If somehow K State pulls that game off, then you're looking at Houston, BYU, or Cincinnati is going to be the team that represents this league. I think it's a one big league. So K State would be my spoiler. Those other four teams being the teams that I think have the best chance as being a contender and representing the league. Your thoughts?
Yeah, Houston's a team I really like in this league. I think they finish 11-1. I like the matchups they have. The only downfall for them is if BYU only falls to Texas Tech to finish out this season. I did some quick math, so I could be off a little bit, and then I've got to project the rest of the teams how they finish. But they would both have that head-to-head loss to Texas Tech, and then it goes to opponents in the league, their winning percentage in conference. And yeah, I think BYU may have them beat a little bit with Utah and Cincinnati on their side there. So that would be a really interesting week if going into the last week of the year you've got three teams that are all 10-1. Houston's going to be rooting for some bottom feeders to win meaningless games so that they've got a chance to get in. I still, like you, Texas Tech is still my favorite in this league. I think they've got too much talent to and I know they play BYU in a couple weeks, so they don't have an easy schedule by any means the rest of the way out, and they play your Kansas State spoiler team this week, so definitely some things to keep an eye on, but I'm with you. This is a one bid league. So that takes us over to the Big Ten. And I'm going to let you get things started off in the Big Ten here, too.
The Big Ten, it's a three-team league at the top with Ohio State, Oregon, and Indiana. I think all three of those teams get into the playoffs. But again, what two teams are going to represent the league in the championship game? I still think that's going to be Indiana and Ohio State. Ohio State's probably the best team in the country because when you look at their team, they run the ball well. Julian Sands playing really well. They're passing the ball well. They're a much better team now that he's evolved as a quarterback than they were week one, in my opinion. And then they're very good on defense, and they do some really good things on defense with the players that they have and the ability that they have. So I think, Indiana, Ohio State is be a heck of a matchup in that Big Ten Conference Championship. And then I think Oregon is the third team, and they'll probably win out to go into that playoff scenario. An interesting team that's kind of came out of nowhere, and we talked about this team last week, and we talked about them losing last week, and they didn't. You probably know what I'm talking about because they won. They won handily. I scratched my head afterwards, and I'm like, they're probably pretty good, or they seem to be pretty good. I'm talking about Iowa. Iowa absolutely handled Minnesota. Again, Iowa's always good defensively. So if I go back a couple of weeks ago, Iowa played Wisconsin and beat them 37-0, the biggest margin of victory in that rivalry. Then they played Penn State in a game where, you had your interim coach. That first week that teams play an interim coach is a tough game for whoever plays that team with an interim coach. And Iowa held on and won that game. Had to score late to win it. And then they were dominant But we're going to find out in 2 weeks on the 8th of November because they host Oregon. And that's going to be really interesting because you're going to have the defensive Iowa against, again, a well rounded team that has a good defense in Oregon. So to me, that's Iowa's shot to make the playoffs. They also go to the road on USC after that. So they have some tough games coming up. But I think you got to throw them in contention for the playoffs. They're not just a spoiler anymore. They host Oregon. If they somehow win that game, I think that puts them right in the middle of this thing. And again, I don't think it would knock Oregon out either. I think if Oregon's got 2 losses and they finish 10-2, and their losses are to Iowa and Indiana, I still think they get in. Michigan to me is a spoiler, and USC is a spoiler. Both those teams have 2 losses, and I think they'll pick up another loss along the way. So I think those are your spoilers. I think your top 4 teams have a shot at the playoffs: Indiana, Ohio State, Oregon, Iowa, and then your spoilers are Michigan and USC. And I still like this league probably as a 3-team bid league. But if I was able to knock off Oregon, then I think you got to throw that into a potential 4-team league. Now, Iowa is sitting with 2 losses, so they do have to win out. So, what's your thoughts on the Big Ten?
Yeah, Iowa's a team I like. They lost an early season game to Iowa State, 16-13, and then lost to Indiana 20-15. So if they somehow beat Oregon, I'm sticking with the Big Ten as a 3-bid league. So I think you really have to, that's something the committee's going to have to look at, because Oregon, right now, Iowa's not ranked. So they will become ranked if they beat Oregon. And I just don't see how a 10-2 Oregon team gets in. Yeah, they would not have their only quality win. Guess if they beat USC later in the season, but if they lose to Iowa, their most quality win is state. So I don't know if that really instills a ton of well, actually, let me take that back. Rutgers is ahead of Penn State in conference play at 1-4. So their best conference win would be over a 1-win team. So I would think, Iowa could make things interesting if they could win out. And, that would also put them beating USC, and then Oregon would beat USC. Again, their best win at that point would be over a 4-loss USC team who's not going to be ranked, when Iowa would have a 5-point loss to, a top 3 team in the country and a win over Oregon. I would think the committee's got to take Iowa over Oregon at that point. So they can they can make things really interesting, here pretty soon. I still think that, Ohio State and Indiana are your 2 teams in the Big Ten championship, and I think Ohio State wins that one, which would give Indiana 1 loss. So that would be my take on the Big Ten. So
What if
let's
what on a scenario here, just to kind of throw something out that could happen. So what if Iowa beats Oregon, goes to USC, beats USC? They're 9-2 going into the last week of the season in a rivalry game, go to Nebraska and they lose by a field goal. That would be a field goal loss on the road to Iowa State, field goal loss to Nebraska on the road, playing Indiana tougher than anybody has all year within a 5-point game. Could they be a 9-3 team that gets in with wins over Oregon, USC? Just a thought.
Yeah, they could be. I think that would also open the door. So you'll have likely Notre Dame. You'll have a group of 5 team. I think we said the door is open for 2 ACC teams. I think that's pretty realistic. ACC getting 2, Big 12 getting 1. So that leaves 7 spots for the Big 10 and SEC. Big Ten's gonna have 2 of those locked up. The SEC would have to really fall apart a bit here. I know we'll talk them in just a second, but I would almost lean 5 SEC teams over a 3-loss Iowa or a 2-loss Oregon at that point.
I wouldn't disagree with you at all. Would you take a 3-loss Iowa over a 2-loss Oregon with a head-to-head?
I would.
I think I would. Again, especially when if you that scenario, if they were to win at USC and their losses are a field goal loss in a rivalry game on the road, and another loss to Nebraska on the road, and then playing Indiana as tough as they did. They played Indiana tougher than Oregon did. So if they were to beat them, played them tougher, I think I would take a 3-loss Iowa. So there's something to contemplate.
Yeah, if Oregon loses to Iowa coming up here soon, I would think Oregon would fall down to around 18 or 20.
At some point, and I think college football has shown to be behind college basketball in this. But the one thing that college basketball gets right in the playoffs is it's not about who you lose to as much as who you beat. Who you lose to matters, but who you beat matters more, and it should matter more. So, to your point, if Oregon doesn't have really any quality victories and Iowa does, and they only have one less or one more loss, but they've got two better victories. I think you got to take the team that has played the tougher schedule and has quality wins.
Yeah, I'm with you there. So that brings us over to the SEC. Man, the SEC's probably the most compact conference still. With the Big Ten, we've narrowed it down to four, but two really good teams in that league. When I look at the SEC, I still see really six teams who could get into the playoff. So love Texas A&M sitting at 5-0 in conference play. Alabama's sitting at 5-0 in conference play. Then you've got the Georgia Bulldogs and Ole Miss both at 4-1. Vandy at 3-1. Texas at 3-1. And Tennessee at 3-2. Out of the seven I just named a few seconds ago, I said six still in contention. I'm eliminating Texas for the time being until we see, they've got a chance to get a big win this week. Man, I almost feel like, your top four in Texas A&M, Alabama, Georgia, and Ole Miss are basically locks to be in the playoff right now. Texas A&M has a pretty favorable schedule down the stretch. They are at Missouri this week, and then they get South Carolina, and then their last conference game is against Texas. You look at Alabama, a game that I know a lot of LSU fans after Labor Day thought, this is going to be a good one. Bama loses a season opener, LSU beats Clemson. Well, Bama now has kind of the easy path. They play LSU at home, they play Oklahoma at home, and then they end up in conference play at Auburn. Auburn always plays them really well, but Bama having those two games at home are definitely a huge plus. Then you look at Georgia. They play Florida this weekend in Jacksonville. Then they play at Mississippi State. They play Texas at home. That wraps up their conference. So, those teams, and I'll go ahead and mention Ole Miss's schedule too. South Carolina, Florida, Mississippi State. There's the real potential for, and Georgia does play Georgia Tech, but if they finish 10-2 with a loss to Georgia Tech or finish 11-1 and win that game, Ole Miss should finish 11-1. You could have Texas A&M go 12-0, Bama 11-1. I just don't see a scenario where any of those teams get left out. And then you look at Vanderbilt too. They play at Texas this week, so that's a big one. Auburn and Kentucky at home, and then finish the season against Tennessee. So when I look at it, I think that last game of the season, Tennessee, Vandy, is going to be the deciding factor for which team gets in as the fifth SEC team. Because I don't know how you could leave out. I mean, you can't leave out an 11-1 Vandy if they run the table.
Nope.
They will have had, they beat an LSU team when they were ranked, a Missouri team. They would have beaten a Texas team and a Tennessee team. So, is there a scenario where a close game in Tennessee's favor pushes Vandy to 10-2, and then are you looking at, 6 teams that should be in from the SEC? From a spoiler role, though, I'm gonna throw Texas, and let me go ahead and throw Oklahoma in here as potential spoiler teams. I just love Oklahoma's defense. I think that could be a deciding factor. Outside of that, Mississippi State is gonna win a conference game at some point this year. I do feel confident saying that. Outside of that, you've got LSU, South Carolina, Auburn, Kentucky, Arkansas. I move those teams all out of the spoiler category right now. What are your thoughts on the SEC, Kevin?
So just real quickly on Mississippi State winning a conference game, it could happen this weekend. Go on the road to Arkansas. I would have to try. I would have to say I think I would take Arkansas, but I thought Arkansas was in great position to win their first conference game against Auburn this weekend. Should have won, and then they turned the ball over. They're up double digits, and then they go into that second half and turn the ball over. Green threw a couple of interceptions, and they let that game get away from them. So I don't think you can say Arkansas is going to win any game as a given. So this weekend might be the weekend that Mississippi State wins a conference game. If they don't win this one, they go to Missouri on the 15th. Missouri's a good team, but Missouri's without both of their top two quarterbacks. So I think they're fixing to be on some really challenging times. Even though Zollers played well Saturday, did not hurt himself at all, but can he do that now that he's a starter? It's going to be challenging. So to your point, I think Mississippi State has a chance to win a conference game. They're playing so competitive. Should have won last weekend. So going back to the things you said, let's just start at the top. A&M's in a great position. I think A&M, you can almost pencil them into Atlanta. I do think going on the road to Texas, the last game of the season, will be very tough for them to win. But this is a different A&M team. We talked about them last week. I thought LSU might play with a lot of energy and passion and get a win. And they did for a half, but A&M just kept punching, and that passion and energy kind of fizzled about midway through the third quarter, and A&M really looked like the dominant team. Marcel Reed is a player that, as they continue to win, more talk's going to be about him winning the Heisman. And they have a chance of going undefeated. And if they go undefeated, I think Marcel Reed is an absolute Heisman contender and maybe the Heisman favorite. So I think A&M's got the best chance to be in Atlanta. I think Alabama has a good chance. That game this weekend, they were very fortunate to eke that game out. I will say that. And that game would have really hurt them. If they would have lost that game and been set at 2 losses, still having to go to Auburn, that game would have really hurt them. But that being said, they've got a good chance, like you referenced earlier, to run the schedule, run the table, and them and A&M both could be undefeated playing in the conference championship game. Or if A&M loses that Texas game, does that put Georgia and Bama playing a rematch in Atlanta? I think those are your best three teams that have the chance to go to Atlanta, with Ole Miss with an outside shot. Again, I don't think Ole Miss loses. I just don't really think. I think between A&M and Alabama, I think there's a slim chance that Auburn could get Alabama, because you cannot rule Auburn out when they play at home against Alabama. And I think Ashton Daniels will be their starting quarterback the rest of the year. He played very well, and their offense played a lot better in the second half. Granted, it was against Arkansas, but I don't think we see Jackson Arnold in that role again. So maybe Auburn finds some semblance of an offense. But A&M, Alabama, strong shot to win out, play in the conference championship. I think Georgia's strong chance to win out conference game wise. They play Texas at home. They've been very resilient, so I think they get the rest of those. And again, like you referenced Ole Miss, I don't think Ole Miss loses a game the rest of the way. So I think those four teams, very likely playoff teams. And then Vanderbilt, man, this weekend's the opportunity for them. They go on the road to Texas, and I do think last week was somewhat of a trap game for them, and they were able to get through it against Missouri, coming off of an LSU win that was very emotional, and they wanted to put themselves in position to finish out their season in a good spot, and they got it. And then Missouri was fighting also to be in that playoff contention. So kind of a trap game for Vanderbilt and a Missouri team that played very hard. They got that game. I think you will get the best Vanderbilt team against Texas this weekend. And Texas is a 1.5 point favorite at home against Vanderbilt. Wow. Who would have thought, in that? So I think Vanderbilt wins that game. And when they win that game, you know, Like you said, it's going to come down to them in Tennessee. And do you end up with 6 teams if both those teams are 10-2 from the SEC? And does the ACC get back down to 1 team? And the Big Ten get 3 teams and 6 teams from the SEC, and then everybody in the other conferences will be screaming. And that'll just get us to 16 teams quicker, which is fine. It's where it needs to be. But I like Vandy's chances. I guess is where I'm going with this. Pavia gets a lot of press, and he is a really good player. But the one thing that does not get talked about enough is Vanderbilt's offensive line. They may have the best offensive line in the SEC. Them and Texas A&M are both up there. And so, when it comes to time of possession, first downs, and the way that they play offense, their offensive line is a huge part of what their team is and what they do. So, again, they struggled against Missouri in the time of possession battle. Missouri did what they do all year. They had it for 35 minutes. Outside of Missouri and Bama, Vandy has won that time of possession battle with that offense and that offensive line. So I think they'll beat Texas this weekend. And when they do that, I think that puts them in a very good place to play in the conference championship. Or not the conference championship, play in the playoffs. I'm sorry. The conference championship, we've already said Texas, not Texas. I got to get my mind right here. Georgia, Texas A&M, and Alabama. One of those 3 teams in the conference championship. Ole Miss is playoff bound. They might eke in that conference championship game, but they're playoff bound. And then Vandy and Tennessee are your other 2 teams with a potential. I'm like you. I think Texas is just a spoiler in this thing. They go on the road to Georgia. They could play a spoiler there. They host Texas A&M. They could play a spoiler role there, and then they play Vandy this weekend. So to me, Texas is your biggest spoiler in this scenario. So but I don't think they can go the rest of their season with just 1 loss, and that puts them at 3 losses, and I just don't think that they played a tough schedule, so I guess maybe a 9-3 Texas could get in. But again, this comes down to who have you beaten. I think by the time we get to the end of the season, Oklahoma will have 4 losses, so that could possibly be their best win, depending on who they upset in one of these games coming up to get to 9-3. So, I think Texas is strictly in a spoiler role. One more team I'll throw in a spoiler role just because of the emotional thing. Again, that interim coach, if you look over the years, that first game that an interim coach coaches, the teams win that game the majority of the time. Look, I don't think I would not pick LSU to beat Alabama. However, I think that is a trap game for Bama with Frank Wilson and that team. I think LSU still has talent. I think that team will pull together. I think they will be emotionally much better. I think there's 2 things from a coaching staff standpoint that has held the team back. Joe Sloan as the offensive coordinator obviously has been one because their offense has been bad. And then I think, things that we've learned down the stretch, Brian Kelly's lack of engagement, no players really saying anything when he's removed from the role. So I think you could see maybe that team bring more fight than they've brought in the last 3 or 4 weeks in that Alabama game. I think you could see them pull together. And so you can't rule them out because they are talented. I throw LSU as a potential spoiler, Texas as a spoiler, pretty much the same thoughts on those top 6 teams that could get in. So
Yeah,
that's
I agree there. One game that I do want to monitor is the Egg Bowl. Last game of the year for Ole Miss and Mississippi State. Doesn't matter how good either of those teams are. That is always a good game. Might be my favorite game of Thanksgiving week when it comes to college football. And I know there's some good ones. Man, you could have when Mississippi State had Dak Prescott. Those were still 1 possession games. As good as Lane Kiffin's been, those are always tough games. So that's one game I do want to monitor. I do think even if Ole Miss slips up and loses a close one, they're still in the playoff in my mind. So doesn't really have any bearing on them making the playoff, but could potentially hinder them from getting into the conference championship.
I agree with that, and I do agree that Mississippi State is a game that playing on the road that they could have a tough time there. But I think, like you said, I mean, look, they went to Georgia, road game. They played very well, led that game going into the 4th quarter. So that's a good loss. That's the only way to say it. Beat LSU, beat Oklahoma on the road, and that game was to me they controlled that game. It was an 8-point win, but To me, I never felt like Oklahoma was in position to win the game. So I'm in agreement with you. I think Ole Miss, even if they lost to Mississippi State, they're in the playoff.
Well, then you're in agreement with Lane Kiffin on who the better team was Saturday.
He sure is getting
Yeah,
some leverage out of that. I loved his answer today after Venables said that they were the better team, and Lane said, "Well, maybe they were the better team when Alabama beat them 55-19. And maybe they were the better team when Alabama beat Clemson." And those were when
yeah.
Lane was the offensive coordinator at Alabama, and he played Brent Venables' defenses when he was a DC. To me, Lane definitely owned Venables last week leading up to the game and talking about the signals, and then he owned him again during the game, and then he owned him again after the game when Venables was making the comments about who the better team was. Ole Miss dominated that game. They kicked field goals. They would have scored one more touchdown and traded it for a field goal. They win that game by double digits on the road. So definitely the better team. I think this is Lane Kiffin's best coaching job. No question about it. It's not his most talented team. Last year was his most talented team, and he's taken this team and they're playing the best football that Ole Miss has played. Period. In the last 10 years, and they've had some good teams in the last 10 years, but he's done it with a Division II quarterback, a defense that has some nice players, but there's not a dominant player on that defense. There's not a first round draft pick on that defense. And their offensive line had a lot of question marks at the beginning of the season. I don't know. Patrick Coyotes might be an NFL player. I don't know if there's an NFL player on that offensive line. Their tight end is an NFL player. And then you look at their wide receivers. Caden Lee is probably an NFL player. Watkins, the freshman, is probably an NFL player, but he's not their best wide receiver now. Where I'm going with that is there's not elite players on this team, but yet they might finish the conference season at 11-1 with just a great coaching job. Kawan Lacey is probably the best player by position on this team. He'll be an NFL player and he'll be a good NFL running back. But outside of that, it's just a lot of really nice, good players, and Lane has coached them up.
Yeah, the team's completely bought in. But I don't know. I'm a fan of Winadad. I heard that name coined for him today on a show. Really just yeah, they're playing at a high level together. That is I think if you're a program that's looking to get back on the right track, whether Lane Kiffin's the coach or not, you need to try and replicate what he's done at Ole Miss this year. Just phenomenal job. I mean, likely going 11-1 with, I would say maybe not even his second most talented team he's had.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely.
Well, that's a wrap from Southern Sports Gumbo tonight. We'll be live tomorrow, Tuesday at 6:30 Central Time. Come ask us some questions. We'll be breaking down games of the week for Week 10. We'll be diving into our player, coach, and team of the week from this past week. And we'll be having a little fun with a playoff draft where we'll be drafting teams we think can win a championship. So we'll see you guys tomorrow.